In 2013, a small British genetics company opened an envelope of lab results and found something that did not match the family tree it was supposed to confirm. The results belonged to two living relatives of Princess Diana, ordinary people with no interest in scandal, who had simply agreed to have their DNA read. What came back pointed to a woman who had been dead for almost 200 years, a woman the family had always called Armenian, and a genetic marker so rare that scientists had only ever seen it in a handful of people on Earth, almost all of them from India. If that marker was right, then somewhere at the top of one of England's most storied family trees sat a woman whose real identity had been quietly rewritten. And if her identity had been rewritten, someone had to have decided, at some point, that the truth wasn't safe to keep. Stay with this one because it is not a rumor and it is not a conspiracy theory. It is a real case study that made headlines around the world, and it says less about a princess and more about how far people were once willing to go to protect a reputation. To understand why this discovery mattered, you have to go back before Diana, before the Spencers were even the Spencers as we know them. For most of the 20th century, the story England told about Diana's ancestry was a simple, flattering one. She descended from one of the oldest aristocratic families in the country, a line so deep and so English that newspapers loved to point out she was, on paper, more thoroughly aristocratic than the prince she married. That story was mostly true. The Spencer line really is old and really is grand. But it is also enormous, branching out over centuries into hundreds of names, and one of those branches, tucked into the early 1800s on Diana's mother's side, belonged to a woman almost nobody outside the family had heard of. Her name was Eliza Kawark, and she was Diana's great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. For 200 years, she was recorded as Armenian. Eliza lived in western India in the early 19th century, during the era of the East India Company, when British and Scottish merchants were sent abroad for years or decades to run trading posts far from home. It was common and rarely spoken about afterward for these men to form households with local women while they were stationed there. Eliza's partner was a Scottish merchant named Theodore Forbes, who worked for the company in Bombay. They had a daughter together, Catherine, born in 1812. When Catherine was 6 years old, Forbes sent her away to Britain to be raised and educated as a proper young Englishwoman. Eliza did not go with her. Forbes died in 1820 on a ship bound home, and in his will he referred to Eliza only as his housekeeper, and to Catherine as her purported daughter, careful, distancing language that historians have since pointed to as an early sign of how the family meant to handle her. Catherine's descendants married upward through the generations, and generation by generation, Eliza's story was smoothed into something more presentable. According to Lady Colin Campbell's biography of Diana, the family later described Eliza as Armenian rather than Indian, because in the social world the Spencers were climbing into, Armenian ancestry could be absorbed into a respectable pedigree in a way that Indian ancestry, tied to the ugly racial hierarchies of the British Raj, could not. That was the accepted story for nearly 2 centuries. Then, in 2013, a genetics company called Britain's DNA decided to test it. Here is where the science comes in, and it's worth slowing down for, because it's the part of the story that actually holds up. Most of your DNA is a blend, half from your mother and half from your father, reshuffled every generation, which makes it almost useless for tracing a single ancestor who lived 200 years ago. But there is one piece of your genetic code that doesn't blend. It's called mitochondrial DNA, and it is passed down only from mother to child, essentially unchanged, generation after generation, along an unbroken line of women. No father, no husband, no man who ever married into the family can alter it. It travels quietly, sealed, from mother to daughter, for as long as that line of daughters continues. Researchers first did the unglamorous, painstaking work of traditional genealogy, tracing parish records and family documents to confirm 2 living people who descended from Eliza Kawark through an unbroken chain of mothers, with no adoptions and no breaks in the line. Both were distant cousins of Diana. Both agreed to give a simple saliva sample. When the lab sequenced their mitochondrial DNA, both carried the exact same rare genetic signature, a haplogroup known as R30b. According to Britain's DNA's own findings, that particular signature had, at the time, been documented in only about a dozen other people anywhere in the world, and all but one of them were Indian. The single exception was Nepali. It had essentially no presence in Armenia, or anywhere in Europe. To be fair to the science, and this part matters, a haplogroup is not a fingerprint, and it is not a hometown. It doesn't tell you Eliza's street address or her family name. It's a probability, built from population history, that traces which broad region of the world a maternal line most likely passed through generations back. Geneticists who reviewed the Britain's DNA findings at the time made a point of saying this plainly. Rare doesn't mean certain, and a commercial DNA company announcing a royal connection is also, undeniably, good marketing for that company. Independent geneticists who looked at the data agreed the pattern was suggestive and unusual, but urged some caution about how confidently the conclusion should be stated. Still, Britain's DNA didn't stop at the mitochondrial evidence. Its researchers also ran autosomal DNA analysis, a separate method that estimates the overall proportion of ancestry from different world regions on the same two cousins. That analysis put their South Asian ancestry at roughly 0.3 to 0.8%, a small but measurable trace, appearing in the same individuals who carried the rare Indian-linked haplogroup. Two independent lines of genetic evidence, pointing in the same direction, in the same two people, both of whom trace back to Eliza Kawark and no one else. That convergence is what made even skeptical scientists take the findings seriously, even while stressing that likely is not the same word as proven. Put together, what the evidence suggests, carefully and without overstating it, is that Eliza Kawark's own maternal ancestry was very likely at least partly Indian, not Armenian as the family had claimed for 2 centuries. Dr. Jim Wilson, the geneticist who led the study, described it publicly as a striking example of DNA answering a specific historical question that documents alone never could. And because mitochondrial DNA travels down that same unbroken maternal thread, that signature didn't stop with Eliza. It passed her daughter, and down through the generations, into Diana's mother's side of the family, into Diana herself, and finally into her sons, William and Harry, who each carry Eliza Kawark's mitochondrial marker in their own cells right now. It stops there, though, because mitochondrial DNA only passes through daughters. William and Harry can carry it their whole lives, but they cannot pass it on to their own children. Eliza's genetic thread, after crossing 2 centuries and reaching all the way to the British throne, quietly ends with them. What makes this story land the way it does isn't really the science. It's what the science exposes about the choices people made a long time ago. If the family's account is accurate, Eliza Kawark's Indian heritage wasn't simply forgotten. It was, according to Diana's biographer, deliberately reframed because in the world her descendants were marrying into, Armenian ancestry carried a certain acceptable exoticism, while Indian ancestry, under the racial codes of the British Empire, was treated as a liability, something that could cost a family good marriages and social standing for generations. That's a specific and ugly kind of erasure. It isn't that no one ever mentioned Eliza. It's that when they did, they reached for a version of her that was easier for everyone else to live with. And there's a real, human sadness sitting underneath all of it that has nothing to do with royalty. Eliza raised a daughter in India and then watched that daughter sent across an ocean at 6 years old to be raised in a country Eliza herself likely never set foot in, for a future Eliza would have no part of. Whatever her name really was, whatever her origins really were, she was a mother who was, by every account we have, left behind so that her child could have a life on the other side of an empire that would not have made room for both of them together. That happened to real women across the colonial world, over and over, and most of them left no trace at all. Eliza Kawark is one of the rare ones whose story survived, not because anyone chose to remember her honestly, but because her body left behind a copy of itself in every daughter who came after her, one that no falsified record and no polite relabeling could ever touch. It's worth saying clearly because it matters. None of this makes Diana's family villains in some unique way. What happened to Eliza's story was common practice across the British Empire, an entire social system built on quietly managing which ancestors were mentioned and which were not. Most of the descendants who repeated Armenian for 200 years almost certainly believed it. Nobody alive today chose to erase her. They inherited a story someone else had already smoothed over, generations before they were born, and had no particular reason to question it. There's also a broader lesson sitting inside the story about how genealogy is changing. For most of human history, family history was only as accurate as the document someone chose to write down, and documents can be edited, lost, or quietly corrected. DNA doesn't work that way. It's not a record someone kept. It's a copy that gets passed down automatically, without anyone's permission or interference, which means that increasingly, ordinary people taking simple genetic tests are uncovering family stories no book or archive ever recorded, stories families sometimes worked hard to bury. Diana's case became famous because of who she was, but the pattern behind it, ordinary genetic testing revealing a family history that official records had smoothed over, is happening quietly all over the world, to people with no famous name attached at all. So here's what actually happened, stripped of any exaggeration. A genetics company tested two of Diana's distant cousins in 2013. Their DNA matched an extremely rare genetic signature almost exclusively found in South Asia, strongly suggesting that Eliza Kawark, the ancestor the family called Armenian for 2 centuries, was very likely at least partly Indian. That signature now sits inside Princes William and Harry, a permanent, unchangeable trace of a woman written out of her own family story, and it will end with them, since mitochondrial DNA cannot pass through sons. The science is solid but not absolute certainty, and serious geneticists have said as much. What isn't up for debate is the human story underneath it, a mother separated from her child, and a family history quietly rewritten to make an inconvenient truth easier to live with. If a story like this can sit hidden inside one of the most documented families on the planet for 200 years, it raises an obvious question. How many other family trees, ones nobody's ever going to write a headline about, are carrying the exact same kind of quiet, ordinary rewrite, just waiting for someone to finally take the test?